There are nights when you turn off the lights, lie down, and close your eyes. The room is silent, but inside your mind, there's a storm. Worries about life, family, illness, failure. They keep flooding in without end. You try to pray, try to believe, but the feeling of unease still clings to you. The heavy sleep, the nights when you wake up in the middle, and then you wonder, do my prayers have any power? Am I truly being protected? It's in those very moments that Psalm 91 is no longer just a passage you once heard at church. It becomes a living shield, a declaration of life, and a spiritual weapon that no force of darkness dares to confront. And here's what few people realize. When a believer reads Psalm 91 with true faith, the enemy in the spiritual realm trembles. Because God's word doesn't just comfort people, it weakens the power of the devil. So, why is the devil so afraid of this prayer? What is hidden in Psalm 91 that causes darkness to retreat? And how can you use this promise as a spiritual armor every night before you sleep? We're going to find out right now. Psalm 91 is not just an ordinary prayer. It is a sacred declaration of complete protection from God. From the very first verse, the Bible affirms, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." This is not just an opening statement. It is a declaration of spiritual rights for anyone who knows how to take refuge in the Lord. You are not alone. You are sheltered under the shadow of the Almighty. He will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day, nor of the pestilence that walks in darkness, nor of the destruction that lays waste at noonday. Whether you are facing anxiety, restless sleep, or negative voices in your mind, this promise is for you. Psalm 91 is like an invisible wall that the enemy cannot penetrate, if you know how to hold on to it and declare it by faith. So for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. You will tread upon the lion and the cobra. These are not just beautiful metaphors. They are spiritual realities. When you read Psalm 91, you are not just seeking comfort. You are rising up and taking hold of the authority God has given you to live and sleep in peace. The devil is not afraid of someone who reads the Bible out of habit, but it is especially afraid of those who understand God's word and live in the authority that word gives. And Psalm 91 is one of the most powerful promises in the entire Bible. It's not just a beautiful poem. It is a battle declaration, a spiritual shield, a proclamation the devil cannot ignore. When you read Psalm 91 in faith, you are reminding yourself and declaring to the spiritual world that you belong to the Most High, that you are in a place of protection where no darkness can reach without being rebuked. That is what makes the devil tremble. Because when you speak these words, you are no longer a person trembling in anxiety. You are someone rising in authority, speaking with the voice of one protected by the Almighty. Night is the familiar time when the devil often sows fear. The mind becomes vulnerable, and faith tends to waver. But if, right before you sleep, you speak Psalm 91 aloud, you are shutting the entryway to darkness. You are building a spiritual wall around your soul. The devil cannot penetrate that shield because it's not built by human strength, but by the eternal promise of God. It fears because God's word is light. It fears because you are no longer afraid. And it knows, once you place your trust in these words, it no longer has any power over you. If every night before going to sleep, you spend a few minutes reading Psalm 91, you're not just doing something religious. You are truly preparing your spirit to enter sleep in safety. Not physical safety, but complete rest in your heart, in your mind, in your soul. When you read each verse of Psalm 91 slowly, you are calming a weary mind, placing your trust again in the one who promised to keep you through the night. You don't need to read it loudly, and you don't need to memorize it. You only need to open your mouth, even whisper and say, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High." You've already begun a powerful spiritual act. As your body prepares to rest, God's word begins to work. It protects your thoughts. It soothes unspoken wounds. It reminds you that in a world full of uncertainty, there is still a safe place. And that place is in Him. Make Psalm 91 your nightly habit. Print out a copy and place it by your pillow. Listen to an audio version when you turn off the lights. Or simply pray its content, like, "Lord, I dwell in your shadow. I will not fear the terror of the night, because I trust that you are my refuge. Send your angels to watch over me and those I love tonight." The difference doesn't come from how fast you read or how perfectly you recite. The difference comes from the trusting heart you bring when you read. Every night, every word spoken is a step you take closer to true peace. The kind of peace the devil cannot steal, and the kind of sleep the world cannot give. Psalm 91 is not just a Bible passage to be read during hard times. It is part of a life of faith, a place you can return to whenever you feel weak, shaken, or lost. Every night, when you enter sleep with God's word on your lips, you are not just resting, you are placing yourself under the protection of the Almighty. The devil doesn't fear how many times you go to church, nor how many Bible verses you know. But it trembles when you truly believe and live in God's word. When you read Psalm 91 with all your heart, you are no longer someone easily attacked. You become someone protected, someone who knows who they are in Him. If this passage has touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone in need of comfort, someone losing sleep from anxiety, someone searching for a safe refuge in a storm-filled life. And if your faith has been strengthened today, leave a comment. I dwell under His wings. That's not just a phrase. It's a declaration of faith. Don't forget to subscribe to Stillwater's Bible to receive more of God's Word daily. And hit like if this video brought peace to your heart. One small share from you could become light for someone in the middle of the night. Thank you for being here. See you in the next video, where God's Word continues to be your light, your refuge, and your place of rest.